This is the Rebel HR Podcast, the podcast about all things innovation in the people space. I'm Kyle Rode. Let's start the show. Welcome back, Rebel community. Very excited for the conversation today. With us, we have Dimple Dabalia. She is a writer, podcaster, founder of an organization called Roots in the Clouds, and author of the new book available now, Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self. Welcome to the podcast, Dimple.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and for spending a few minutes here. So far, so good. We're recording this right in the middle of the solar eclipse, and so far it is not Armageddon. So we're going to assume that that's a great omen for the rest of this podcast.
I was just going to say, we still have some time left.
There is still some time left, so we'll see. So if there is some weird disruption in the middle of this, I wish all the best to everybody and their families through this human event. And obviously for many people, it's just like mid-May. They're like, what in the world are they talking about? So good for all of us for still being here. Well, thank you so much again for joining, and I'm really excited to dig into this topic today and into the book a little bit. I think this is really gonna align well with what we're all about here in the Rebel community. So, first question that I have for you: what motivated you to write the book "Tell Me My Story: Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self"?
Yeah, well, thank you. So I spent almost 20 years working in the government on asylum and refugee issues. And about 12 of those years were spent what we call in the field, actually interviewing asylum seekers and refugees for resettlement in the U.S. And it was an incredible job. But as a result, I encountered certain what I call occupational traumas along the way. So things like vicarious trauma, moral injury, compassion fatigue, and ultimately burnout as well. And what I realized, so basically 6 years into my job, I was on assignment in Zambia. And up until then, I had always really taken pride in being able to create what I called a wall of professionalism. So I could sit with an applicant, take in their whole story, and not get emotional about it. But 6 years in, I am in Zambia. We're interviewing. It was one of the worst trips I'd ever been on, and I'd been on a lot at this point. But we were interviewing the last of the 94 Rwandan genocide survivors. We were interviewing the Congolese, which I don't know if you know anything about the war in Congo, but it's some of the worst atrocities you've ever heard of. And then what we call protracted Burundians. So these are people from Burundi who were born in refugee camps and then subsequently had their camps attacked. And so they were kind of refugees twice over. So really, really difficult stories. A lot of stories that revolved around rape as a tool of war. And it was the first time in my career that I found myself unable to regulate my emotions. And so as the applicants are sharing these stories with me, I am crying. And, we were working really long hours. When we go back to the hotel, most of us would head straight for the bar. I wasn't sleeping, or if I did sleep, I was having these nightmares where I was reliving the trauma that I had heard about earlier in the day. And so I knew something wasn't right. And I was very fortunate because when I started my career out of law school, I actually worked at the Attorney General's office in Denver. And my boss there recognized the work that we were doing at the time was around child abuse and neglect issues. And he recognized that this kind of work, it impacts us as human beings. And so we used to go through this vicarious trauma training every year. And I remember as a new kind of cocky attorney, I was like, why are we doing this? I don't need this. I can do my work. I can read my cases and eat a sandwich while I'm doing it, which probably should have been a red flag. But I had, it planted a seed for me. And that seed kind of came to fruition a full decade later on this trip. And what I realized very quickly, though, is that my organization really wasn't resourced to support me. And there was so much shame and stigma because nobody was talking about what they were experiencing. So for me, it felt like I was the only one going through this. And so I kept it to myself. I tried to figure out how I could help myself without telling anybody what was going on. And after a little while, I started thinking about it and I realized, I can't be the only person experiencing this. There has to be others who are also going through what I'm going through. And so I was very fortunate because when I rotated back from overseas, I ended up in a position where I had a bit of a platform. And so I started advocating from within my organization that, we need to be addressing these occupational challenges and traumas that are very real to this kind of service work. And so I kind of pivoted within my organization and started focusing on workforce, mental health, well-being, things like that. But about 5 years into that, after developing a whole leadership program that was based in mindfulness and positive psychology and creating all these programs that were really supporting our workforce, I had, the unfortunate kind of face-to-face reality that there was still a pretty good chunk of our leadership that didn't support the work that we were doing on my little team. So that really got me to realize if this was important to me. I really think that it takes a certain person to be in service this way, and we're losing people because people aren't, the organizations aren't looking out for these kinds of issues in their staff. And so at that point in 2021, I left my job and founded Roots in the Clouds, which is a boutique consulting firm where we're specializing in using the power of story to heal organizational trauma and moral injury. And so it's really challenging these pervasive beliefs that sacrificing personal well-being is inherent to serving others. And so really we want to kind of change the culture of organizations and move them from being really solely metrics driven to more human centered, and focusing on healing that organizational trauma and prioritizing a holistic human centered duty of care that, hopefully will become the norm rather than the exception.
Absolutely. And first of all, I think, maybe start off with, saying thank you for doing that work that I think many of us don't even have the context for what that's like to listen to somebody that's been through that just extreme, trauma. Right. Yep. And I think many of us in the, in the world of corporate workplaces, don't really have an appreciation for that. But I think what's interesting is there are some corollaries to what you were talking about. And I like the term that you use, this wall of professionalism. Mm-hmm. And so often at work, we're supposed to do that, right? We're supposed to put on this facade or flip this switch and become this professional automatron. I had a similar experience when I was much younger in my career, where I would flip a switch and literally become professional Kyle, and then I'd be HR Kyle, and then I'd flip the switch off and I'd be like actual Kyle, and I got to a point where I couldn't do that in good conscience and really look myself in the mirror at the end of the workday. And I think there's many of us that struggle with that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are many of us who struggle with that because it's not, I think that this is, honestly, I talk about this as the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, because, the Industrial Revolution was all about creating efficiency and the problem, and it worked in these kinds of factory settings. But when you think about the professions to which this model was applied, it was applied across the board. And the reality is that we are not machines. We are human beings with emotions and lives outside of work. And so this idea that we can bifurcate ourselves, and I always say this when I work with leaders, that we don't leave a piece of ourselves at the door when we come into work each day. No matter how much we think we can compartmentalize, we are carrying all of that with us. And so it does impact how we show up and our ability to focus and connect with other people around us, which is the whole reason that I think that this idea of creating human-centered workplaces is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's been interesting that, as we continue to watch all of these metrics of, mental health concerns, being ever present in the workplace, and burnout being at all-time high, and engagement scores going down and down and down consistently year over year, in the Gallup survey as an example, that people are starting to wake up that, hey, maybe this model's not working as well as we all like to pretend that it was for everybody, and or maybe more accurately, it's not working for everybody. Right. Because I think it is working for some. But certainly my experience and my perspective would be that our duty of care for employees expands well beyond just workplace safety, but it also expands into what we're being asked to support now, which is some of these mental health resources and prevention of burnout, and actually making it a great place to work. So I'm curious, we throw around the word duty of care quite a bit, certainly in the context of like insurance, right? But I would argue that it goes much deeper than that. So how do you define our duty of care as an employer for our employees?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So duty of care, it actually is a term that originated in tort law. And like you said, it has historically focused on the physical health and safety, or safety and security, not even health necessarily, but the safety and security of staff. What's interesting is in the book, I talk about this, and I think that I've always thought of that as a given, that it's at a baseline. Most organizations provide that. And lately, I have to say, by what I'm watching in the news, that that's actually not even the case. But when I'm thinking about duty of care, I'm really looking at this as, this idea that we have kind of these 4 pillars. And so when we're looking at the whole human being, and so any duty of care, I really believe needs to be grounded in social connection and empathy. And it has to address the mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, and relational health and well-being of the person, because these are all the components that create a flourishing human being. And so if we want people to show up at work and flourish and do well at their job, we need to help them be healthy in all these areas. And I don't want to create the impression that I'm saying, I say this all the time, that I'm not saying that, we're talking about therapy at work or anything like that necessarily. But there's space especially when we talk about the idea of creating psychological safety and building trust, there's space to create that form of connection and empathy, so people can show up more closely as the whole version of themselves, rather than having to put on that mask or that armor that we hear about so often. And so this is really kind of what the duty of care is about.
We'll be back after a quick break.
And so used to having everything in front of them right away that we forget that innovation just takes time. I myself, I get frustrated too. Why? And this as being one of my best friends is, hey, I talk to you all the time. Hey, man, I'm frustrated in the fact that I can't seem to just get there in the next day. But that's just not how these things work, right? Innovation needs to be planned out. It needs to be very methodical. And then when it finally hits, that's when it seems like to everyone else that it sort of just came out of nowhere. But to you, the amount of dedication that it took over that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about that perspective is, I think we all intuitively know this, right? Like it's one of those things, and I guarantee that there's probably some specific research studies that we could point to, but the reality is, like, because we know this about ourselves, right? If we feel like if we're not getting our our mental needs taken care of, or if we feel physically unsafe, or we feel like we're like not fulfilling our purpose or our spiritual needs in some way, shape, or form, or we don't have those relationships at work, that it's just not, it just doesn't feel right. Like there's something off, and you can't really like be fully present because you really can't be fully yourself. And I think that so much, I think that can cause so many challenges within an organization, and has caused much of the issues that we've already mentioned here today. So as we look at that, I think one of the challenges from my standpoint is kind of figuring out, okay, like it's easy to diagnose like something's off, but now how do I go about kind of triaging this? How do I put a solution in place, or start to build a system that allows for some of these 4 pillars to actually be in place for my team?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to name the 4 pillars. So the first is to normalize and address occupational mental health challenges and traumas. The second is to evolve from metrics-driven cultures into human-centered ones. The third is to support rest and recovery. And the fourth is to foster shared purpose and commitment. And so I think the biggest kind of challenge to all of this is so many, I keep using this term organizational trauma. And so most of us have heard of individuals being traumatized, right? We experience trauma, we get wounded. And the same way our organizations can experience the same thing through our systems. And it kind of makes sense, because if you think about it, the systems that we operate within are created by individuals, and individuals, again, are bringing, whatever their, like the lens through which they have experienced the world into creating these systems. And so I often describe it as the water that we're swimming in. And so if people aren't familiar, there's this anecdote of 2 fishes swimming along. Another fish swims by and says, "Oh, hey boys, how's the water today?" And the 2 fishes kind of keep swimming along, and one looks at the other and says, "Well, what the heck is water?" Right? And so it's this idea that we are so immersed in these systems that are toxic and unhealthy, but have become the norm, that we almost don't notice it anymore, or we allow for it. And so and collectively, especially in mission-driven organizations, we're so focused on addressing the overwhelming needs of the mission that we just stop noticing when things aren't right within the organization itself. And over time, this creates this cumulative impact of not addressing the needs of the organization, and specifically the people in the organization. And so there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. So things like lack of transparency and communication and decision-making, top-down issues that don't consider workforce health and well-being, perceptions or actual racial, social, or other inequities and unfairness, outdated policies and procedures, and then, this lack of acknowledgement of a lot of these occupational traumas that I was talking about. And so this is a process. And, I think part of this is when we are in this place where we need to create these new policies, we need to have help. We need other people who aren't immersed in our culture to come in and help us see what the issue is. And so part of this, I think, is really having honest discussions between staff and management. And so when I first started my firm, I was hired by a government agency that has a historically terrible reputation for racial inequities, not just within the organization, but with the clients that they serve. And one of the issues I had was there was no acknowledgement of this past history. They just wanted to jump into creating these DEI programs. And I kept saying that the problem is that without acknowledging the past, and this isn't about blame, this isn't about, anything like that, but it's acknowledging that sometimes we inherit these systems too, right? But if we don't acknowledge them, there's not that credibility. And so there's not that trust. There's not that psychological safety yet. And so all of this has to be built to get to that point of addressing these root issues. And that's really what it comes down to, is we have to address root issues and heal root issues in order to then rebuild a culture that is actually going to create the space of connection and belonging for everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's it's probably the first time that I've really kind of reflected on that, on the organizational trauma piece. And I think it's probably pretty uncomfortable, especially for somebody in human resources that's listening to this, to hear, like, because then there's some like implication that, oh, that's partially my fault, right? I didn't address that policy that I knew was just kind of archaic and silly and fairly inequitable, but it's been around for 40 years, so we'll just leave it alone because we know it's going to be a headache, right? But there's so much of that, and so much of that, I think, like, I love the analogy where it's like a fish swimming in water doesn't even realize it's in water, right? Like, I think that's really, really powerful. And so to your point, as we kind of look honestly and reflectively at our organizations, and we actually start to acknowledge what this trauma is doing to our teams, what kind of a cultural shift do we need to make to essentially just say enough? And what have you seen actually work for an organization that really needs to address some of these root issues in order to get on a path of healing?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's different for each organization, right? Because it starts with, what are your root issues? So part of, I think there's some great ways to create surveys and other things to hear from your staff, to get a sense of what's the perception, what do people feel are issues right now. And to your, point about, especially for people in that space of like the HR space, again, it's really, it's easy to fall into that feeling of people are going to blame me. But we have to look past that. And, I think that it's worse when you are aware that something is wrong and you choose not to do something about it. So once that awareness is formed, I think that's more important. And so part of this is, figuring out the current state of the organization. So it's not what the leader thinks it is, but what it actually is. And so, organizations need to really look at the facts and understand staff experiences and their perceptions before creating a plan. And so it's helpful, again, to bring in someone who specializes in this type of work to help the organization take the right approach. And then, like I talked about with acknowledging organizational history. And this can be really hard because organizational amnesia is so common and runs very deep, especially when it comes to racial and social inequities, biases, subtle acts of exclusion, or what are also known as microaggressions. It's not fun to talk about these things, but we have to. And the more that we can acknowledge the mistakes and choices from the past, and the corresponding impact, that's like a huge step towards healing some of these divides, right? And these forms of trauma, and building a foundation so that we can create more diverse and equitable and inclusive environments moving forward. And then, making sure that we're aligned with our organizational values. A lot of time, there's a lot of organizations out there that tout this idea of core values, and yet their actions don't always align with the core values that they set out. And this is where we see a lot of this idea of moral injury happening, right? Or other forms of trauma happening when, our organizational ethos and our organizational values are one thing, but I'm being asked to do something that completely goes against that. And that's a problem. Mm-hmm. And then fostering kind of organizational spirit, right? So we want to nurture and spirit the spirit and of the organization, and create this sense of belonging within teams. And, when I work with leaders, I talk a lot about this, that this, when we think about this idea of empathy, empathy is not this squishy, super emotional thing. Empathy is the ability to be present to another person in this moment. And so it's not about doing anything extraordinary, but it's about, being with your people. And this is easier said than done. And I recognize that because we operate in these environments that are working so quickly. Things are changing constantly. Everyone is overworked. It feels like there's not even time to go sit and have lunch. Or I remember there were times where I couldn't even get to the bathroom and it was just so frustrating. And so I understand, but this is part of what we have to change, right? We operate in this culture of busyness, and we tie self-worth to productivity and profit. And that's what needs to change, is that has nothing to do with my self-worth, And so we need to start shifting these kind of bigger picture things and addressing these root issues by determining what they are in order to start making those shifts, which is not easy. And then the other piece of this is, this idea of shifting from metrics driven to human centered. And again, I don't want anyone to think that I don't understand the value of metrics. I think metrics are incredibly important, right? Metrics help us determine if we're meeting our goals. The place where metrics start to become a problem is when they are the only driver of our policymaking. And so this is where, human-centered cultures factor in how, workloads and certain decisions are going to impact our staff. And so I think along with metrics, there has to be this human component in each and every policy that's being made, so that that human factor is considered. And it's not this afterthought, which I think is what we see a lot in the way that our cultures are set up.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm curious. I'm going to ask the community out there, just send me an email telling me the last time that someone got really, really excited and engaged because you gave them a new key performance indicator measurement. I just want to, I want to know because I'm going to challenge that. Yeah. But I think it's this is all just such a powerful concept. And I think what's interesting about this approach, and I think you and I probably agree on almost everything related to this, but the reality is it's so simple of a concept for us to think about these things, right? Like it's simple to think, well, yes, I need to be present with my team. That's being a good leader. Or no, metrics are not really going to get people excited and feel like they have a strong sense of belonging with their fellow team members, right? Or, yeah, when people are too busy to even use the restroom, it's probably not a great place to work. But the reality is that we lose sight of this stuff. And the day-to-day like grind just kind of takes our eye off the ball on this. And it really is easy to, before we know it, we're literally swimming and we don't even realize we're swimming in this toxicity.
Exactly. And that's why I always say it's simple, but it's not easy.
Correct.
Because,
much of, my entire job. It's like we learned much of this stuff in kindergarten, but that doesn't mean that anybody does it well.
Yeah. That's always a thing, right? Like at what point do we lose that? All those basic things that we learned as children.
The same time that we decided we had to do standardized tests instead of actually what kids do, recess.
Yeah, true.
But I think, this might be a little bit tangential, but I think you mentioned this earlier, so much of this comes from like the industrial organization or industrial revolution rather, where organizations decided, hey, if we can measure it, now we can incentivize it. We can make people do it differently and we can get better. And I think that's helped us in a lot of aspects of society at large. And I think, certainly in, productivity focused roles, I think it can be extremely helpful, but, human beings are much more complex than that. Mm-hmm. And just because I can efficiently sit on 12 Zoom calls back to back in a day and have.
But
all
are
the
you really
meetings.
Efficient?
No,
Yeah.
no. Like after like 3 of these, I'm like, my brain is mush, and I'm like
Exactly.
like getting, half attention, and just trying not to say anything stupid, and it's like it's not effective. There's better ways to do it, right?
Well, and so I teach a course called MPEAK. So it's Mindful Performance Enhancement, Awareness, and Knowledge. And one of the things we talk about in there that most people don't realize is that 47% of the time our minds are wandering. And that's on a good day. So that means that, so this idea of this 8-hour workday where we expect people to be seated at their desk and it's not happening. It's not happening. It's just not going to happen. And so I think that's really, it's interesting, and it feels counterintuitive, but the more that organizations start to put people at the center of their policy making, the more that they actually start meeting benchmarks and are able to better fulfill operational needs, right? Because we are creating the space for our humans to show up as humans and do the work. And we can still meet the needs of the organization, but we're doing it in a different way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important call. 47% of the time. Okay, that makes me feel a little bit better. I promise I have not been mind wandering 47% of the time here. I swear. I want to touch on something here before the end of our time together here, and you mentioned this early on, and that's vicarious trauma. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's really kind of a risk in, at least in the human resources occupation, is this risk of you use the term vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, moral injury, burnout, anxiety. I think all of these can be symptoms of a profession where you're primarily trying to help people through their problems, whether those are personal or work related. And it's really easy to just absorb all of that and just kind of take that on, because I think for the most part, most of us are helpers. We're trying to be helpful, right? And we want to do something to help people with their challenges. So what advice do you have for us who might be in that profession or even just in a general leadership profession that is struggling with this kind of this fatigue and risk of burnout because of these things?
Yeah, so it's a great question. There's a couple of things. First of all, these occupational traumas, occupational challenges, they are a part. I mean, we especially after COVID, we see them popping up even more in just regular corporate settings, but especially in these kinds of what I call humanitarian professions. So anyone that's working to alleviate pain and suffering in the world. So we're talking about medical professionals. We're talking about, aid workers or, first responders. All these things are even more likely to happen because of the nature of the work. And so that's kind of one thing to think about. I think that in terms of taking in other people's trauma, so this is part of when I work with leaders, there's often this feeling like, I don't want to ask people about their grief. I don't want to ask people how they're really doing because I don't have the capacity to take that in, or I don't know how to deal with when they say something. And again, this is where empathy can be really, really helpful, right? So again, empathy is not doing anything extraordinary. It's not trying to fix anything for anybody, but it's that presence. And one thing that I've learned through all my travels is that at the end of the day, as human beings, we just crave to be seen and valued and heard, right? And so if we create that space, number one, to do that, that in itself is a really big step. And then the other piece of this is boundaries, right? So boundaries are not selfish. I talk about them that they're gifts of clarity. And the problem is that most of us were not taught the benefits of boundary setting as children. And so now trying to honor our limits through boundary setting can feel rude, it can feel aggressive, it can feel selfish. But boundaries aren't any of these things. They're gifts of clarity. They help us create accountability over our time and energy. And so they allow us to feel safe and respected, both physically and emotionally. And they're really at the heart of self-care, which is what protects us from things like burnout and exhaustion and illness, and allows us to actually thrive in our life and our work. And it's not, again, it's simple, but not easy, right? And so this is something where we have to practice. And unfortunately, especially for women, I think that boundary setting often comes with a lot of guilt. And so part of this is learning to reframe our guilt. It's learning to practice saying no. And I say, and all boundary setting is a practice. And it's a practice because we have to keep practicing it. But it's like a muscle that can be developed. So just like we go to the gym and lift weights to create, the muscles in our body, the more that we practice these things, the easier it becomes to default to them when we need to. And then the other piece of this is at the heart of all of this. So, like I was talking about the leadership program that I created in my previous organization, it starts with the leader first in terms of, and when I talk about leader, it doesn't necessarily mean a specific title or anything like that, right? But this idea that everything starts with self-awareness. And so even though, a lot of leadership programs are so focused on how we're treating other people and all this stuff, it's all important, but we have to start with ourselves. And so we have to create awareness around our thoughts, around our emotions, around how these show up in our body, because our body is sending us signals all the time. And then we pair that awareness with compassion. And a lot of times, especially working with high achievers, which I think most of us are, there's this feeling that compassion is too soft and that compassion is not going to motivate me. Compassion is challenging. If you've ever tried to be compassionate towards yourself, it is one of the hardest things that you can do because we all have that inner critic, right? That's constantly telling us all the things that we're doing wrong or why we're so terrible or whatever it is. And so compassion, we so easily give compassion to others at times where, we give them that kindness that they need. And so that's one aspect of compassion, is turning that kindness towards ourselves. But that's the kind of yin aspect of compassion. The yang aspect of compassion is this kind of tough love, right? And so when we're in this space of compassion, it's easy to kind of fall into that soft side of, well, okay, it's okay, don't worry about it. But that tough love side is the one that keeps us coming back to say, well, no, you know what, we didn't quite hit what we wanted to do, so we're going to try it again, or whatever it is. So compassion is actually a yin and a yang as well. And so when we bring those two things together, we're in a place where we learn to regulate our emotions and our nervous system in real time with greater ease. And that's really, so then when we sit down with people, because of the mirror neurons in our brain, it makes it easier because we can regulate ourselves, which then helps to regulate the other person as well. So then we're not taking in a lot of stuff necessarily, but we're learning to create that space where people can show up, share what they need to, and we help them kind of get back into a space where they can actually connect and focus and everything else. So.
Love it. Love it. All right. Well, it's been an amazing conversation here. Again, the book, check it out. Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self, available where books are sold. Dimple, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We're going to shift gears. We're going to go into the Rebel Flash Round. Are you ready?
Yep. All
right, here we go. Question number 1. Where do we need to rebel?
I think just what we've been talking about. So challenging the narrative of service before self. So stop looking at the humans in our workplaces as resources and see their humanity, and commit to providing this holistic human-centered duty of care.
Yeah, we don't have time to jump into the whole title of human resources. So, but we'll just leave that. We'll just put that one on the shelf, and you can kind of read between the lines on that deal. Question number 2: who should we be listening to?
Well, going back to this feeling of self-awareness, definitely ourselves. So, again, starts with creating self-awareness. But then I always also say Ted Lasso all day, every day. I think he is such a great case study in human-centered leadership. And then also in real life, I think the Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, I think he's doing some amazing work with loneliness and a framework for addressing mental health in the workplace.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm not wearing them today, but I do have the Ted Lasso goldfish socks that I like to wear just as a reminder of old Ted. Be curious, not judgmental. One of my favorite snippets of any show ever. So,
yeah.
All right. Final question here. How can our listeners connect with you and get their hands on this book?
Oh gosh. Okay. So, speaking of Ted Lasso, I have a podcast called What Would Ted Lasso Do? And it's lessons on life and leadership through the lens of leadership and positive psychology. So there's that. Another podcast called Service Without Sacrifice. I'm at Dim Story across all major social media platforms. And the book is available at all major online retailers and on my website, which is www.rootsintheclouds.com. And that's all plural. And for anyone who's interested, I am doing a 50 for 50 challenge this year, trying to get in 50 book events before I turn 50 next January. So if you or anyone you know might be interested, there's information on the website for that and how to reach out.
We will have all that information in the show notes. Open up the podcast player, check it out, click in. Dimple, thank you so much for spending the last few minutes with us here. And we are still here at the end of the eclipse. Congratulations, we've survived. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
All right, that does it for the Rebel HR podcast. Big thank you to our guests. Follow us on Facebook at Rebel HR Podcast, Twitter at Rebel HR Guy, or see our website at rebelhumanresources.com. The views and opinions expressed by Rebel HR Podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any of the organizations that we represent. No animals were harmed during the filming of this podcast.
Baby.